Senderovich. Dr. Senderovich is assistant professor of gender and women's studies and obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a public health researcher and feminist social demographer, focusing on global sexual and reproductive health and rights. She's one of the most creative demographers today, exploring the ways we conceptualize and measure reproductive autonomy. Her mixed methods research focuses on contraceptive autonomy specifically, exploring the ways that new approaches to measurement and evaluation can promote person-centered care and reproductive freedom. Professor Senderovich's work has appeared in Demography, American Journal of Public Health, and Population Studies, among other key journals in the field. She's also part of a feminist demography collective, which I recommend that everyone in the room should check, especially the graduate students in the room. They actually have a very exciting day at PAA on a PAA Wednesday, the day before PAA, with lots of activities, very interesting talks that are all free. So you should definitely check it out, Feminist Demography Collective. So please join me welcoming Professor Senderovich.
Thank you so much for that extremely kind and very lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here to talk with you all. Let me just make sure I got my timing right here. I'm really happy to be here with you all to talk a little bit about my research. And at the end, if I have a second, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the Feminist Demography Collective, because it's the thing in my life that I think I'm most excited about right now, work-wise. As Professor Martelletto was just saying, I'm an interdisciplinary mixed methods researcher with a background in global health, demography, gender studies, and I spend a lot of time thinking about both like what we measure and why, and also what we don't measure and why, and trying to bring in a historical perspective to how our measurements were created, what the political moment was that informed their creation, and now that that political moment is over, whether or not those things are really still the thing that we want to be measuring. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today in the context of global family planning. I'm going to start with a background section, a short section on what I like to call the tacit ideology of measurement. I'll go into my project that focuses on measuring contraceptive autonomy, and then some time on next steps and where we're going in this political moment. Okay, so a little bit of context. One of the really interesting things about family planning is that people come to it for a lot of different reasons. Susan Watkins and Dennis Hodgson in 1996 called the family planning community one of strange bedmates, because you have a lot of unexpected alliances going on. So we have people who are coming to family planning for feminist reasons, where they think contraception is a matter of rights and sexual freedom, environmentalist rationales to alleviate climate change, protect biodiversity. There's certainly economic rationales to achieve a demographic dividend, reduce poverty, improve microeconomic outcomes at the family level, and public health rationales to protect and improve maternal and child health. And I don't know if you'll be able to see on these screens, but this is sort of an example of how all of these arguments are sort of mushed together and marshaled to support family planning advocacy. So you can see this family planning advocacy website calls family planning the smartest investment we can make, capable of improving outcomes in everything from HIV/AIDS to education, to water and sanitation, to malaria, as well as bringing significant savings across sectors. And so in this way, you can see how family planning is portrayed as sort of a silver bullet, capable of solving all of the multidimensional challenges to global poverty, unsafe living conditions, and ill health. And with so much stated upside and almost no stated downside, the challenge for family planning practitioners around the world has been framed as how we can maximize contraceptive uptake to its highest levels possible. But of course, we need to remember that despite all of these benefits, family planning has not always been an emancipatory project for all people. And instead, family planning has been tied in with a range of efforts, both to control fertility overall, as well as to decide whose bodies get targeted for fertility reduction. And so in the United States, I'm sure you all know that the eugenics movement targeted the bodies of minoritized racial and ethnic groups, disabled people, people living in poverty, among other groups, for compulsory sterilization. And in the Global South, I guess I should have a shout out for Paul Ehrlich, who just passed away a couple of days ago. But really his book, The Population Bomb, helped sort of foment the resurgence of neo-Malthusian concerns about global overpopulation, which were really central to the birth of the international development sector after the end of the Second World War. And so, for example, USAID was founded in 1961, and in that very same year as its founding, it began funding population research as one of its very first activities. And I'm glad I got this screenshot before they took everything offline. But this was a screenshot from the USAID Family Planning website. They have this timeline, and again, maybe the type is too small for those of you in the back to see, but you can see how Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon in the 1960s all motivated US development assistance for global family planning as a way to control overpopulation in poor countries. So President Johnson, for example, said that he would seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity of world resources. And Nixon called population growth one of the most serious challenges to human destiny. So think about that, the most serious challenges to human destiny. Given these like apocalyptic stakes, right? Apocalypse, the world is going to end. This is the most serious challenge to human destiny. The legitimacy of coercion during this time was frequently affirmed. So in 1979, Bernard Berelson, who was the president of the Population Council at the time, published this paper in PDR advocating for what he called a stepladder approach to contraceptive coercion, saying that we should use the least coercive form of coercion that we can to achieve the fertility outcomes that we want. So he said there are undoubtedly cases of justified coercion, but that overt violence or other potentially injurious coercion is not to be used before non-injurious coercion has been exhausted. And this was a pretty common view about the need, right, for getting fertility down to avoid the population bomb that was going to destroy us all. So many countries in the Global South during this time, with the full support and encouragement of USAID and philanthropicapitalists like the Ford Foundation, adopted population policies that included things like economic penalties for high fertility, recruitment quotas for providers, and compulsory sterilization for women. You can see some of the messaging around this here. So we have an example from Singapore, whose family planning messaging was there about 1, 2, and that's ideal. There were financial penalties leveled for families who had more than 2 children. And in India, actually to this day, there are still financial payments and other incentives for women who agree to get sterilized. And you can see from this, I don't know how to point with this. You can see from this banner that the amount of the incentive you get is correlated to your parity basically at the time of coercion. So if you already have a lot of kids, the amount you get paid for your sterilization is lower than if you have your sterilization at a lower parity level. So feminist scholars and activists, of course, did not take all of this lying down. And organized to contest these types of reproductive violence that were perpetrated in the name of population control. Here you have a poster from a San Francisco-based artist named Rachel Romero, who created this image in 1977 to contest the forced sterilizations that were going on at that time. This was actually in California. And all of this kind of came to a head in 1994, which is the year that the UN held its famous International Conference on Population and Development, also known as the Cairo Conference. And this conference, of course, became the well-known reckoning where substantial and well-organized feminist opposition confronted the population control establishment and demanded an end to coercive family planning. And so, to quote this article from The Lancet, the Cairo Conference put the ideas of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, choice, women's empowerment, a life cycle approach, and gender equity at the center of the international agenda, and signaled the end of the so-called population era. So there's this like conventional wisdom, there's this claim that, what's going on with that D? I'm sorry about that. There it goes. So there's this claim that the Cairo conference really changed everything. We have what folks call the post-Cairo shift, in which this focus on population control, fertility reduction, and demographic targets is replaced by a more holistic focus on gender equity, reproductive rights. But the central argument of my talk today and of my work more broadly is that this post-Cairo shift has been much more successful as a rhetorical maneuver in terms of changing what we talk about in family planning and global reproductive health than it was a substantive shift that changed what family planning programs actually do. And so I'll just show a few examples of state-sanctioned contraceptive coercion in the year since. Of course, there have been efforts to control fertility overall, like the one-child policy in China that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. There were these sterilization camps that operated in India through 2016. There have been efforts focusing on ethnic minorities, like in Peru, where indigenous women were targeted. Efforts focusing on people living with disabilities or with chronic illness, such as this example from Namibia, where people with, living with HIV were targeted. Examples where people of color or women of African descent are targeted, like this example from Israel. Examples where people who are trans, gender nonconforming, or non-binary are targeted, like this example from France. Examples where people living in poverty are targeted, like this example from Australia. Examples where people with intellectual disabilities are targeted, like this example from the UK. And I had my choice of examples from the US, but I chose to focus on this example where people who are incarcerated were targeted. And so here you have examples of people experiencing contemporary contraceptive coercion from every inhabited continent on the world, targeting just about every kind of group that you can think of across axes of race, ethnicity, disability, class, geography, and more. And so if society is stratifying people across an axis, I guarantee you that we are stratifying reproduction across that same axis. You might be thinking that it's not fair to sort of pull out these headline-making cases of human rights abuses because that's not how most mainstream family planning programs operate. And I think that's a fair critique. It's really important to note that virtually all mainstream family planning programs have denounced these types of overtly coercive programs or practices, and they take a lot of care actually to affirm the importance of voluntarism in their programs. So if you read about global family planning, you're going to read about voluntary global family planning. We really talk a lot about voluntarism. But I think it would be a mistake to dismiss these cases as outliers or the result of a few rogue providers or out-of-touch bureaucrats completely unrelated to how most family planning programs are run, because the reality of stratified reproduction and the ideological focus on keeping certain types of people from having too many babies is woven through the very heart of the contemporary global family planning movement. And so I think you can see that if you look at the research agenda for what global family planning measures and what we investigate. And so I know I don't need to convince a room full of demographers that measurement matters. Like we all know that measurement matters. But I do really love this quote by an anthropologist named Sally Engelmary from her book, The Seductions of Quantification. And I think it's worth taking a minute here because Mary says that statistical knowledge is often viewed as non-political by its creators and users. It flies under the radar of social and political analysis as a form of power. Yet how such numerical assessments are created, produced, cast into the world, and used has significant implications for the world, for the way the world is understood and governed. And so in demography, I think we often take indicators and family planning indicators, for example, like objective counts of a given phenomenon, but what we choose to count and how we choose to count it are the political decisions that reflect the political worldviews of the people who made them. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about like who invented our family planning indicators? Like what political agenda were they wielding? And whose perspectives do they help us understand and whose perspectives do they help us understand? And so here's a list of some of our core indicators from family planning, according to a USAID project that is no more, but was until recently sort of the main coordinating body for family planning data. And if we look at what's being measured here, we can see measures of contraceptive method use, we can see measures of fertility desires, we can see age-specific fertility outcomes, we can see measures of method mix, measures of contraceptive knowledge. And if, now that USAID is no more, maybe IHME will be the reference. I think we're sort of figuring out who's going to be the new keeper of the indicators, but if you think it might be IHME, we can see that they're measuring contraceptive prevalence. Again, so we have fertility, we're measuring fertility preferences and contraceptive use, intent to use, but it can actually sort of blow your mind if you look at these methods and you think, actually, is there a health outcome here? Is there anything that's measuring access? Is there anything that's measuring rights? Is there anything that's measuring equity? And there's nothing, right? There's absolutely nothing here that tells us anything about quality of care, respect for autonomy, or health outcomes. And so, I think that that's worth noting. And I also like to talk about this paper from the WHO. They convened a meeting a few years ago of family planning experts to conduct a priority setting exercise for what should the future of family planning be during the SDG era. And let's take a look at what their priorities were. So we can see that they decided that the #1 area of interest was to identify barriers to uptake. The #2 area of interest was how to improve uptake. The #3 area of interest was how to increase uptake. And the #4 area of interest was how to overcome barriers to uptake. So again, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair here because, it's different types of uptake, right? Post-abortion uptake, postpartum uptake, right? So there's sort of it's each a different flavor of uptake. But what we can really see is that uptake remains at the very heart of the family planning research agenda. And again, I think what we can conclude here is that while our motivations for family planning maybe have changed since the Cairo conference, our measurements haven't followed suit, our research agenda hasn't followed suit. And that has resulted in this fundamental misalignment, right, between what we say we're doing on one hand and what we're actually doing, what we're measuring, what our programs are doing on the other. And so this is, I argue, because global family planning is still pursuing a tacit ideology of population control. And of course, what we measure is not just, something that we debate in our ivory tower, right? But in global health in particular, the way that we use measures for agenda setting, program evaluation, funding allocation, this means that what we measure and how has really concrete implications for how services are delivered and how people receive their care. And global family planning in particular has seen a really increased reliance on quantitative target setting. Some of you may be familiar with this SP 2020 initiative, now called SP 2030. It began in 2012, funded in large part by the Gates Foundation. And the goal of this initiative was to add 120 million additional users of modern contraception by 2020 in the world's poorest countries. And in the words of the program's architects, the success of FP 2020 will first be evaluated on the basis of quantitative verification to determine that the goal was reached. And the way that this initiative worked is each country then made a pledge to be responsible for a certain part of that 120 million new users. And so you can see here, this is part of Ghana's pledge to FP 2020. This included an aim to increase modern contraceptive prevalence from 22% to nearly 30% among married women, 32% to 40% among unmarried women by 2020. And they also pulled from a pre-existing population policy to affirm the goal of reducing total fertility from 5.5 children to 3 children per woman. So not just contraceptive uptake targets, but quite literal fertility reduction targets. And some governments were even more specific than that. This is a screenshot from the Burkina Faso National Plan to accelerate family planning. I'll just translate it into English for you in case your French is rusty. And you can see here that the government set not only a target of overall modern contraceptive prevalence to increase it up to 32% by 2020, but they also set method-specific targets for how they wanted to get there. And so this plan for increasing contraceptive uptake includes a focus specifically on promoting long-acting methods like the IUD, the implant, and the injectable. And so that sort of really informed the questions that guide my research, which are what happens to people's experiences if and when it's fertility goals that drive family planning programs? And also, how can we create family planning indicators that measure and promote this post-Cairo agenda of reproductive health and autonomy? And it actually, this really hurts my heart. People indulge me for a second. I won't have time to show you any of our qualitative results that answer that first question. But like first and foremost, I'm a qualitative researcher. And so if you're interested in learning more about how we're theorizing contraceptive coercion and seeing contraceptive coercion manifest, I invite you to read some of our published work on this, but I'm going to skip over it here. And so instead, I'm going to spend the rest of our time together focusing on how we're trying to develop this new measure of contraceptive autonomy that's very much informed by those qualitative results, and we'll spend the rest of our time together on this. So first of all, we need to figure out what a good outcome looks like, right? Like, what does success look like in a family planning program? And I started off thinking that really what I knew is that we had to do something really different than the status quo, because for most of recent history, it's been pretty straightforward that a good outcome in family planning is method use, and a bad outcome is non-use, right? If you look back to that WHO priority setting exercise, uptake, right? So uptake is good, non-uptake is bad. And this sort of simple dichotomous measure is at the core of just about every one of those family planning measures that I listed for you before. But if we add just one more criterion to our understanding of what success looks like, we start to get a little bit more complicated, right? So if we add the second criterion, is the column to the right still always good? Is the column to the left still always bad? I argue that we need a new definition of success for family planning that's not dependent on the person's status as a contraceptive user or non-user, but instead on concordance between what the person wants and what they have. And so it's based on this concordance that I propose a new measure. This was the easy part. This took a day. And I was feeling really good about myself. I was like, I did it, made a new measure. Turns out no. Measurement development is really hard. And particularly, what the heck do we mean by wanting a family planning method, right? Like, as FP method, that's pretty easy to measure. We can measure it. How do we measure whether someone wants something? Because we know, as social scientists, that a lot more goes into a decision than just what somebody wants, right? There's a lot more that's going on here. So we define contraceptive autonomy as the factors that are necessary for a person to decide for themselves what they want and then to realize that decision. And then we broke this notion of contraceptive autonomy down into these three categories of informed choice, full choice, and free choice. So basically, a person needs to have good information, they need to have access, and they need to be free from barriers or coercion and make a choice on. Again, I was feeling pretty good about myself. I have this definition going on. And we can bring that back to our contingency table and now start to sort of fill in who falls into each of these boxes. In box A, we have people who made a free, full, and informed choice to not to use family planning. Box B, people who have a family planning method but did not have full information, access, or freedom. In box C, we have people who do not have a family planning method but lacked full information, access, or freedom in that decision. And we might think that this might be trying to get at the same thing that unmet need is trying to get at, maybe, or what we think unmet need should be getting at. And then in box D, we have fully autonomous users of contraception. And then once we have this schematic worked out, we can start thinking through indicators. So the sort of most basic indicator that I propose is sort of goes back to that a notion of concordance that I was talking about, where it's a simple proportion of autonomous users over the population as a whole. And this might not seem like a big deal to folks in this room who might be asking, like, well, what's the big deal here? But to my knowledge, this was the first approach to measuring contraception that acknowledged that people could choose not to use contraception and that was actually okay. And that autonomous non-use was something that programs should get credit for respecting as opposed to trying to change. And so the idea here is that we can maybe try to eliminate some of those structural incentives for coercion just by changing what we're measuring and how we're evaluating programs. And so we piloted this idea in Burkina Faso in 2018. And again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to dive right now into all of our findings for you, but this is published, so anyone who's interested should go check it out. But I did want to spend some time talking about how hard this process of measurement development has been and how challenging it has been to try to think through distilling something as complex as autonomy into a binary outcome. And I think it's probably worth pausing here to be honest with you that I think this first approach to capturing contraceptive autonomy taught us a lot more about what doesn't work than it did about what does. So there are some really sticky measurement challenges that we're still trying to figure out, and I'll just discuss a few of those here. The first one is how to measure free choice. And again, long story short, it's really hard. I don't think we did a good job at all on our first go around. So I'll just show you very quickly some tiny snippets from our in-depth interviews and our focus groups. Interviewer asked, are there cases where the healthcare workers constrain a woman to use a contraceptive method? And I said, yes, the health workers do that. Allison said, if you space your births too closely also, and at delivery you suffer a lot, the health workers will force, they will obligate. Danielle said, if it's her 9th child, the healthcare provider will forbid her from having any more kids and put her on contraception. And our interviewer asked, in your experience, have they ever forced a woman to use contraception? And Marissa said, yes, the health workers often force. These are our qualitative results. Now, we tried to measure it, and we asked the question in a bunch of different ways in our quantitative survey. We asked, did you feel any pressure from your healthcare provider to use your method? Did you feel like you could say no to your method? Did you make the choice to use your method voluntarily? And are you currently using your method even though you don't want to? So we asked the question using a bunch of different formulations. And you can see how many people, I wish I could, I can't point.
Unfortunately, no, that
Okay.
Becker's pointer.
Okay.
Yes.
So you can see how many people reported the adverse outcome. 3 people out of over 1,100, almost 1,200, said they felt pressure. 26 said they didn't feel like they could say no. 22 said that they weren't using it voluntarily. And 22 said that they were using their method even though they didn't want to. And only 35, because people could report multiple, and so only 35 reported at least one. So a few things could be going on here, right? One is that qualitative methods are not good at getting at the prevalence of things, right? Like that's not what they do. And so it could be that we just happen to pick a sample of people who were experiencing contraceptive coercion at higher levels, or they were reporting it to us, something that happened to a neighbor but didn't happen to them, and or maybe there was one high profile case that everyone was referring to, right? Like we can think of reasons why this might be appearing in the qualitative work, but not in the quant. And so it could be that this survey is showing us that contraceptive coercion is vanishingly rare in this population, and that the qual was misleading us. That's a reasonable explanation. It's not what I think is happening. I think based on how much of this we got, like I just pulled out 4 examples, but almost every interview, people were like, oh yeah, they definitely do that all the time. But people don't want to say yes to one of these questions, or they don't want to report an adverse outcome in one of these questions. And so we're thinking through why that might be. People might not want to admit to themselves that they were coerced, right? Oh, that happened to my neighbor. That didn't happen to me. I'm strong. That wouldn't happen, you know, like whatever sort of cognitive dissonance people are telling themselves to make them not want to answer yes. Or it could be a social desirability bias that in the surveys, when we don't have time to sort of develop rapport in the same way with qual, people don't want to admit to the survey taker, to the data collector, that they've been coerced. There might also be some sort of normalization of disrespect and abuse that's going on. We see this a lot from the maternal health literature, that things like this are happening, but people don't really see it as that big a deal or that bad. And so there doesn't really occur to them to say yes when they're asked a question. We can think through a lot of reasons why this might be. And some of these issues might be addressable if we do more rounds of cognitive interviewing and more rounds of qualitative work and more rounds of testing. Maybe we can come up with a better question. Or, I hope this isn't the case, but it might be, this might just be the kind of thing that you can't measure on a survey. Like, we don't use surveys, for example, to measure abortion prevalence. It's not the right tool for that question. It might be the case that surveys are not the right tool for measuring coercion, and we might never be able to get an accurate self-reported measure, which would be a bummer because I've spent a long time trying to figure this out. But that might be the case. Here's another puzzler. Here's another sort of interesting piece of the puzzle. The plot thickens because we wanted to, we saw that the responses to these questions were a little bit funny. So a friend of mine was doing a survey in Kisumu, Kenya, and we put some of these same questions onto her survey and got some funny answers. Look at this crosstab. Here we have people who felt unable to say no to using a method, and here are people who felt pressured to adopt a method of contraception. Those are not the identical construct, right? But they're not completely unrelated. And yet, look at how differently people are answering those questions. When we calculated the kappa statistic, not only was it insignificant for agreement between the two, but it's negative. They're actively disagreeing, not just not agreeing. So what in the world is going on here? The truth is that we just don't know. We have no idea what's going on with these questions. And I wish I could have come here today being like, here is my shiny new contraceptive autonomy measure. We did it. And instead I'm coming here to you all with a story of how hard it is to develop brand new social measures. Does anyone have any ideas what they think might be going on here? I have no idea.
I think they are two different questions.
Yeah, I think so.
And so you would not expect them to be.
I think they're two different questions too, but I don't think that they should be actively opposing each other.
Having two different questions, each different answer. The other thing I'm wondering, like you said, abortion, people use methods to collect information on abortion where the interviewer provides an opportunity for the respondent to fill out anonymously the answers. So you tried that.
No, but it's an interesting approach.
But that's what they do for abortion. And so I would think you might want to try something like that.
That's a great idea. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about whether the felt unable to say no to using a method is a response to broader societal pressures, and the other one is just about the provider.
Interesting.
So going from society to the provider is not pushing me, but society.
That totally could be it.
There's a substitution effect where the discourse that resolves the cognitive dissonance is I wasn't pressured, but I couldn't say no.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that. The other thing that I was gonna mention, been using, as a person who spends a lot of her time, dealing with questionnaires and questions and how to measure things. We've have been using conjoint experiments. So I to try to remove social desirability. So we can talk more about the details, but that's something that I would highly recommend, precisely to remove social desirability.
I think an innovative survey approach is very much
well.
called for. No, great. Was there a hand in the back?
I was gonna say the idea of pressure, I feel like that's also a question, it's kind of what Patricia said, it's like a question of character. It's like this is like, how do you construct pressure? And I think, and in your case in Kenya, I don't know the societal, what that means. And I think that could be different from like region to region and from area to area.
Yeah.
So it might not be, that's the only thing I could think of, that it's not as clear cut.
Yes. It's a really good point, which is like, you know, one we love to be like, oh, it's validated, and now I can take it anywhere. You know, that's sort of the premise behind some of the tools that are, you know, very near and dear to our hearts, like the DHS and the MIX and the other surveys. But of course, everything, every measure is relying on a different understanding is relying on an understanding of social concepts that are not at all static, but are incredibly dynamic. We did some cognitive interviewing on this question in Wisconsin. And one of the things that we ended up adding to our question in Wisconsin when we asked about pressure was we added regardless of your final decision. Because one of the things that people were telling us was like, they tried to pressure me, but I said no, I stood up to them, so I was not pressured. And so there are just some interesting little tweaks that maybe we can make through improved item development. And so let me just go on, I guess, to sort of what we're doing next. So we're engaging in some more this was a sort of a theory-driven approach to data analysis in the past. Now we're moving on to using some more formal psychometric approaches to latent variable modeling with the data that we already have to see if this can help us sort of make sense of some of these puzzles that we're seeing. And in particular, I'm excited about this last approach with these. It's a newer method around latent network models that I'm hoping can help us sort of understand how some of these questions relate to each other. But again, we're also, I think, going to like go back to the drawing board here. There's so much we don't understand, and so we need to do a lot more formative qualitative work, more IDIs, more FGDs, more cognitive interviewing, hopefully with some longitudinal follow-up, because I'd love to be able to like interview someone with a qualitative interview, then a month later give them the survey, sort of see if there are what seem to me as the researcher to be inconsistencies between what's being reported, and then follow up with the person a third time and be like, well, you told us in your interview that you said X, and then in your survey you said Y. Can you help me understand that? So we're hoping to be able to do some longitudinal follow-up. And we, to this point about cross-cultural transportability or measurement invariance across contexts, we have new rounds of data collection planned for Nepal and Kenya. And we'll use this very cool approach to cross-cultural comparison called meta-theme analysis to try to sort of figure out which components of autonomy seem pretty robust to different contexts as opposed to which ones seem really sort of rooted in their place. Yes, please.
I wonder how this varies by age of the respondent, by the number of children they already have, whether they married or not, and sort of the context itself, so that there may be some of what.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ways of thinking about it, also the environment.
Absolutely.
How varying in that environment. I think just a simple question may not get at where you want to go.
Yes. I mean, this is the real challenge of trying to quantify something as expansive as autonomy into what will at its end need to be a binary yes, no. Do you have contraceptive autonomy? Yes, no. Variable.
Maybe it's not a binary answer.
Maybe it's more nuanced than that. I was going to add to what
Is it gradient on this? I think putting it into just too narrow.
And also, I think going back to the old way of doing I used to do, which is unmet need, being like, you want to get pregnant, you know, to want to have a baby soon, when, etc. I think adding, I don't think we should throw that away to construct this, right? Because that is part of the phenomenon that we want to measure, right? Do they want to have child now, soon, later? So I see the criticism and I take it, and in reading your work can see that's, I mean, you're taking an important challenge, but I think I would not throw away the want or don't want to get pregnant and when.
Yeah, it's a really interesting debate. Actually, we just had a webinar with the Ohio Population Consortium. I think were you? I can't remember. Yeah. John Casterline was really making this point too, that he feels like we're veering too far away from a focus on do people's fertility outcomes match their fertility desires.
Yes.
Which I think is a really interesting point. My sort of intervention in that discussion, and I think maybe my response to your comment too is like, I agree that that's a really important thing to study. I think it's really different than whether or not people want to use contraception. And I think what I didn't like about unmet need was that it assumed that anyone who wanted to avoid a pregnancy needed to be using contraception. And, you know, there are a million reasons why we can think of that's not the case. And so I think that both measuring, like, are people able to meet their contraceptive outcomes and are people able to meet their fertility outcomes are both important questions, but not the same question.
And I fully
Yeah.
agree, but throwing the desire for pregnancy completely away from this,
Mhm.
I think it's also mistaken. That's my take. Yeah. It should be incorporated.
Into the contraceptive autonomy?
Yeah.
Maybe if we were thinking about reproductive, I think contraceptive, for me, I see contraceptive autonomy as distinct, but part of the, maybe this larger umbrella of reproductive autonomy. But it, you know, these are really good
Yeah.
questions and they're really important debates and I'm like thrilled that we're having them.
Yeah.
And I really agree that like whether or not people are able to avoid a pregnancy that they don't want or have a pregnancy that they do want is a really important question. And maybe something we can apply the same logic to about concordance.
I wonder whether you asked the question, maybe it's the type of method, maybe you can also innovate.
Yeah.
You know what?
We have a lot of data on that actually. But we're not finding anything yet using those theory-driven models that I mentioned to you. But as we move into some of these more sophisticated psychometric models, I'm hoping that they'll be able to pull out some patterns that I wasn't able to pull out on my own.
So for example, like their ideal contraceptive method.
Yes.
We have that in the DCC as well. We have, if they're using what they're using and what their ideal is.
Yes.
That also is a good measure.
We actually have a very, it's making data analysis extremely difficult, but in order to capture all of these methods, we ask all of these nuances. We asked basically people the same questions 14 times for each of the 14 contraceptive methods that was approved for using Burkina Faso. And we had a huge module that we asked over and over 14 times. Can you access, could you, like if they're using the IUD, we asked them about the condom, could you access it? Where would you access it? Why don't you use it? Would you prefer to be using it? And it created a data structure that's actually a nightmare to work with, but we do have all of that.
But do you have any findings? Like what do you?
We haven't, from that analysis, we haven't picked up anything that's particularly interesting yet. But again, we're trying a different methodological approach now that I'm hoping will let us wrangle the data a little bit better. Okay, so what's the long-term vision for this indicator? As I mentioned, it's a pragmatic intervention, and that's sort of why I'm talking about condensing it down into something so narrow and losing all of the nuance, is because if we're trying to tell the Gates Foundation or IHME or any of these other global health organizations, you measure this instead of contraceptive prevalence, it can't be 19 different constructs in an entity, right? It has to be concise. And that's been sort of the promise and the pitfall of this project from the beginning, is trying to make it a pragmatic intervention as opposed to necessarily the most. If it were me, I would just write an ethnography and call it a day. But we're trying to sort of intervene in these measurement economies, basically. And so the goal was initially to put this get it onto the DHS and to the NSFG and other similar surveys that would allow us to both compare between contexts and then also look at how things vary over time. Of course, this plan hit a roadblock this past year when the current administration ended the DHS program, which has really sort of thrown me for a loop, and I'm still sort of scrambling to figure out what we do in the absence of the DHS. And also, so much of my sort of rationale for this project was like, look at what USAID has been doing. And now that USAID is gone, it's also been hard to think through. And so I don't know if any of you have ever flown out of the Milwaukee airport, but when you go through security in Milwaukee, they call the area where you like put your belt and your shoes back on the recombobulation area. And this is a metaphor that's really resonated for me. I'm in a recombobulation area of this research right now. Because as the global health landscape has shifted so seismically, I'm having to rethink who is the audience and the target for this research in the absence of USAID and with the United States engaging in global health so differently. Does measurement still matter in the way that it mattered a couple of years ago? Where could this measurement land if it's not going to go in the DHS? I've also been thinking through whether antinatalism is on the wane. USAID was sort of a big engine of global antinatalism. And so without USAID, is antinatalist family planning still as big of a threat to reproductive autonomy, especially in the global South? And as pronatalist ideology surges, how can I ensure that this work attends to the sort of opposite but still identical threats to reproductive autonomy that antinatalism and pronatalism pose? And, I'm thinking through how we can apply theories of stratified reproduction to this work and think through the fact that it's not really pronatalism or antinatalism, but pronatalism for whom and antinatalism for whom, and how we can make sure that this measurement work and this research agenda more generally is attending to that complexity. So I'll stop here. I'll thank my funders and thank you all so much for watching. I'm happy to do thank you.
Questions, comments, suggestions? I know there was a lot of conversation throughout the talk, but
I'll plug our feminist demography collective here, and I'll leave the QR code up. For
Well, I
folks.
just want to say it's really
Yes.
important.
Thank you.
But I think your point about the. Also,
It's terrifying. I'm asking myself questions that 2 years ago I never thought I'd be asking myself about, like, how do I make sure this measurement can capture people having access to no contraception in the United States? Things like that I never thought. I never thought we'd be dealing with, but it seemed very close.
it's very important to measure both. Sorry, was there a
I think that the concept of autonomy is very difficult to get at because I think it's something that, like, if I ask myself, like, what decisions have I made autonomously, I like run out of ideas kind of very quickly. Because we're all growing, right? Like, if culture is this tool belt, right? Like, culture is gonna push us in some directions and not others. So I'm curious if there's any notion of kind of counterfactual, like, measurement that you can take on. So I would have taken this contraceptive measure, right? I took this contraceptive measure. Had my provider given me information on another one, would I have changed my mind? Like, measuring rather like what would have changed my mind rather than like what led me to that direction. And like it's like an ascending scale, right? Because there's a point where you're gonna get like societal pressures on what having a child means for in my culture, right? Like that would have changed my mind.
It's a really interesting question. Best survey practice, according to the survey methodologist, is to avoid asking people hypothetical situations, which makes it hard because all we want to know about is hypothetical situations. Like, we're so curious about hypothetical situations and we want to ask people. And it's really hard. In our qualitative work, I ignored the guidance not to ask not to ask hypothetical questions, and I did. I started out the qualitative in-depth interviews, again, after many rounds of iterating this question, with the question, if God came down to earth and offered you the chance to be reborn, how would you want your life to be? That's not how I would phrase the question if we were asking it in the US. But after many, many iterations of like, basically, like, how would you want your life to be different? In Burkina Faso, that was sort of the phrasing that we landed on. And even with that phrasing, people had a really hard time answering it. It was all, not all, for the most part, the answers were, I want my kids to go to school. I want them to be healthy. I want them to get an education. I don't want them to be poor. I mean, that logic was still very much the guiding logic that they worked within. And I wouldn't say that question was a failure because we did learn a lot from it, but we really had a hard time getting people to imagine, like, if my culture were different, if I weren't constrained by coloniality, right? Like, it's not really well suited to a question that you ask people directly. But I think your point is a good one, which is like, would you rather be doing something different? We asked people that, and they would. So we asked non-users, do you wish you were using a method of contraception right now? We asked contraceptive users, do you wish you weren't using a method of contraception right now? And a fair number said yes. But the thing is, we don't know why, right? We don't know why they say that. It might be because of coercion or something that the family planning program did wrong, or it might be I got my last injection a month ago, and it takes, I'm ready for it to be done, but it won't wear off for another 2 months, right? There are a million reasons why people might answer that question, but aren't really getting at the specific thing that we're trying to measure. But there's no good way to measure it.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. Now, I have a question about, the current discussions, how this informs, the below replacement fertility and all this stuff. The finding that's out there is that this disconnect between desire and actual family size. The women want more kids than what they have.
Yep.
And have you thought about incorporating that into your notion of autonomy? Like autonomy is actually achieving your desired family size?
Yeah. Again, I think that's very
Unrealized fertility.
Unrealized fertility. Folks are doing that. And this is contraceptive autonomy as opposed to reproductive autonomy. And I'm viewing contraceptive autonomy as sort of one line under this umbrella of reproductive autonomy. Reproductive autonomy is you're able to have the kids that you want. If you are experiencing involuntary infertility, can you access fertility treatment? That would go under reproductive autonomy. Can you access abortion? There's so many things that are part of reproductive health that are not related to contraception that I just because of like mission creep and all of these things, I'm keeping this focus on contraceptive use. But I think that it's a really important question and a really important reminder that we not view contraception as the only thing that matters to reproductive health. And if you look at the SDGs, unmet need or a correlative unmet need for contraception is like basically, for all intents and purposes, the only indicator that's supposed to reflect universal access to sexual and reproductive health services. So in the past, I think you're really right to point out that in the past, we focused on contraception as like the only thing that compared to this expansive umbrella that includes so much of people's ideas about family formation and what they want their lives to be in a much wider than just do I want to use contraception or not. And this is narrowly focused.
Thank you so much for this. This is such a energizing and important talk. I was wondering, I'm curious if you could speak to kind of your broader research agenda and this idea of kind of excavating the tacit ideology of measurement. Are there other areas where you're working on that? Contraceptive autonomy?
I've been focused really narrowly on this, and I'd like to be able to branch out. Was there anything in particular that you were thinking about? Like this is we should do this indicator, we should do this.
No, I don't know. I mean, I've thought a lot about like sex and gender.
Yeah.
But here, you're pushing kind of more from identity categories, which I think there's a lot of good work on, to kind of actual demographic processes, which are maybe less critically interrogated.
Yeah.
And so it just has my wheels spinning. I don't know anything.
I think this is like, for me, this sort of critical approach to demography that is sort of self-reflective on what has demography been doing and why is such an important thing to do. My sort of axe to grind is in like fertility and contraceptive use, but I think you could take this approach and this critical sort of measurement area to just about any area of demography and be like, well, like this one guy at Princeton decided that we should do it this way in 1956, and so we're still doing it this way. You know, like I think that critique that I have of contraceptive measures could probably be applied across demography, and that's one of the things. Thank you for this. It's one of the things that we're really trying to encourage with this feminist demography initiative is for sure to take a critical look at how demographers are classifying people by sex, gender, and other things like that. But like almost everything we measure, things that don't seem related to sex and gender actually probably are. They're probably related to race and racism in some way. And so that sort of healthy skepticism and self-reflection, I think, is something, even if it's not specific to sex and gender, something that would be very welcome in this feminist demography space.
So just about the feminist demography, the deadline was yesterday.
Yes.
Open? Would you open for if there's any graduate student interested?
I think so, yes. We're not gonna review them for another couple of days. So if the abstract is only 100